What is art?
Art is
history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is
disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly. Hello out there. Thanks for tuning in. My guest this week is Allison Maria Rodriguez, a first-generation Cuban-American artist working predominantly in video installation. Allison is widely exhibited. She has had solo shows all around Boston, at the Boston Children's Museum, Dorchester Art Project, Spoke Gallery, Boston Cyber Arts Gallery. She's also shown in group shows at Smack Mellon in New York, Fitchburg Art Museum, Boston Center for the Arts, and many, many more. Throughout the conversation, we talk about Allison's relationship to her family and heritage and the connections she makes between the personal and the environmental. Stay with us. Allison, welcome to Art Uncovered.
Thank you so much for having me and for your interest in me and my work.
Yeah, I'm so excited to learn more about not only your work itself, but the way that you think, because you make really beautiful and wonderful connections between different elements of our life on this planet. So I think the first project that I would like to talk about is your installation that's titled Subversive Dreams. So for this project, you interviewed women identifying and non-binary artists about the fantasies that they create or created in their past, to help them get over childhood traumas. And the research that you obtained in those interviews resulted in wonderful videos that are part video, part collage, part sculpture. And listeners, we'll talk about the aesthetics of those videos in a minute. But to start, I'm wondering if you could talk to us a bit about the larger concept behind this project. And my understanding, and feel free to clarify if my understanding is wrong, but I'm seeing this connection between childhood imagination and climate change. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a bit about that relationship.
Absolutely. So Subversive Dreams was an exhibition that happened at Emerson Contemporary New Media Gallery in the summer of 2020. And it was designed with COVID in mind. So these videos, which are part of a larger series called Legends Breathe, were exhibited outside the building via projection from inside facing outward so that people could experience them outside the gallery space. The Legends Breathe project itself, you're definitely right, hitting on the link between climate change and childhood fantasies. What I'm interested in is basically the power of creativity and the imagination in overcoming trauma and overcoming obstacles and discovering new ways of being in the world. There is a parallel going on between the healing of an individual and the healing of the planet. And this kind of intimate relationship I think I'm trying to make I think it manifests itself through these fantasies that these different artists had between our own self-preservation and the preservation of the planet.
Can you give us an example of one or some of these fantasies?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So basically what I do is I interview different, like as you said, female-identified and non-binary artists and creatives about some sort of fantasy they had in their childhood that helped them to overcome trauma. So we don't at all discuss the trauma. We discuss the fantasy purely. And I interview them in whatever method is comfortable for them. That could be face-to-face. That could be on the phone. That could be via email exchange. Some of them, because they are creative, some of them have different outputs like writing. And I ask them to kind of go into as much visual detail as possible with the fantasy. And I make it that I'm not endeavoring to recreate it. I think that's not possible. It's an imagining. It's imagining of their remembering their childhood fantasy. So it's kind of going through the memory of the past and into the present And then that's also going through me and my visualizations and my ideas. So I view the interview, and then I make it a rule to only go back to that person one more time once I'm already in the process of creating the work, in order to ask some clarifying questions that I've come up against that I really want some guidance with. But generally speaking, after that, we don't work together moving forward on the project.
And how come?
A few reasons. One is that I'm not asking this individual to collaborate with me and commit a huge amount of time towards creating a work of art. They're having this moment where they share this, which is with empowering kind of story with me. And usually I can actually, if I'm looking at their face, I can see the joy while we're having this conversation.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. So it's exciting because it's a conversation about trauma that's uplifting, that's empowering, that's filled with joy. And I think that's a bit of an oxymoron, but it's part of what I love about the project and why I framed the project the way that I did. I'm not asking these individuals to go into the deep traumatic experiences that they had. I'm asking them to tell me about their power, to tell me about their survival mechanisms, to tell me about their creativity, which I see as an essential part of their survival skill set.
And is that why you chose women and non-binary and women identifying artists?
I started out with women identified, and then I opened it up with non-binary because I felt like that made sense. I'm not sure exactly why I placed the restriction on there originally, to be completely honest, beyond that I'm a woman and I was interested in working with women and hearing women's stories. And so being that I'm focused on marginalized identities to some extent, I felt like that it made a lot of sense to bring in non-binary artists and creatives as well.
And I want to go back to this connection again between these fantasy stories that were created by people to overcome trauma and this connection to climate change. So can you dissect that connection a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. When I approached the project, even though I'd already ventured into making work that was almost exclusively about climate change and species extinction and this idea of universal interconnection, I didn't initially see where this project related to that. And I think that that's partially because my work is a few steps ahead of me, usually. Like, I'm conceptually behind where my work wants to go, and I haven't figured that part out yet. But I soon started to realize we find every interview without any sort of prompting from me and interviewing folks that I don't know anything about their backgrounds really. There's always been some element of the natural world in which solace and power and strength is gathered. Be it that there's a protective force from some sort of animal guarding, or that there's tranquility and a connection to oneself through water or the landscape. It just figured in so heavily to how we relate to ourselves. And I think that that's also a reflection of childhood and the way that there isn't this huge differentiation between yourself as a child and I personally think other animals and the planet and the earth. I feel like that's something that's far more taught as we become older than how we quote unquote like naturally relate to the planet.
I'm wondering if there's, because I guess when I was looking at the work, I was kind of thinking of this idea of just imagining possible like other scenarios and using imagination as a form of like problem solving. Was that in there as well, or is that just my projection? No pun intended.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, Usually, when you're a child, you don't have a lot of agency. And these are ways that you're trying to reimagine yourself within the world. And I think that ability to reimagine yourself in the world or imagine the world differently is a skill set that's necessary in moving forward with social change. Like, if you can't imagine the world differently, how can we make it different? So I do see this kind of idea of cultivating fantasy and play as an actual tool that can be used in changing the way that we live our lives fundamentally.
There's another project that seems related on a number of fronts, and this is your project In the Presence of Absence. And some of the connections I see are, visually speaking, these like kind of fantastical, gosh, I don't even know what to call them, because they're not really like videos, they're not animations, they're kind of like moving collages. And maybe in a minute we'll actually get to the aesthetics. But another connection that I see in this work is, again, this connection between climate change and some other seemingly separate entity. And in this case, it's the connection between climate change and your identity as a Latinx person. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a bit about this relationship that you see.
Absolutely. And that, what you hit on right there, is actually a strategy that I have about how I approach climate change issues in general. I try to think about intimate and diverse ways of approaching this topic that are not the customary way of approaching it. So I do go for these kind of more highly personalized, intimate ways of thinking about things and imagining things. So that's definitely the case with this project, where I'm paralleling basically the loss of biodiversity with the loss of culture as my ancestors pass away. So I'm posing the relationship between these two things, ecological and cultural loss, side by side. I consider that piece in and of itself to be really highly personal because of how it evolved, but it's definitely been received in a way that it doesn't feel that way. Folks automatically kind of project into the work, and even though it's very much about me, it becomes very much about many other things. So,
other things like what?
So part of what I hope with my installations, like when In the Presence of Absence is an immersive piece where you walk in and you're going to see different videos that have elements of magical realism in them, where I'm taking photographs of my deceased Cuban ancestors and juxtaposing them with video or animations of extinct animals or endangered species, and they're also juxtaposed with different data visualizations of hurricanes that impacted Cuba. So you're seeing all of these things. There's also, I use a lot of lighting effects and projection and things like this. So it's an immersive experience that's sort of intended to make you feel something. Rather, like, my hope is that the viewer starts feeling when they walk in, as opposed to like thinking. Thinking is kind of something that happens after. But I'm hoping that because it's rhythmic, it's meditative, it's sacred, it has a very heavy sense of spirituality to it, that it opens you up to the possibility of thinking about things differently, and the possibility of connecting to something outside of yourself, something larger than yourself, which ultimately is the planet, the world, the other species, other cultures.
You mentioned that you used photographs of some of your, like older photographs of some of your family members. And I think that's one of my favorite parts of the visuals of this project, is because so there's movement in these videos, but the movement is not within the photographs of, I assume, your deceased family members. So I guess I'm wondering if you could talk to us about maybe your interest in like old family pictures.
Absolutely. So a part of my process is very much about going with instinct and going with my gut and seeing where that leads me and how that evolves. And it often has me working out issues in a way that I don't intellectually comprehend until much later in the process. And for this particular project, I was very drawn to looking at this image of my grandmother, who's deceased, and old images of her. And I ended up putting this image up in my studio alongside an image of an extinct Tasmanian tiger, a thylacine, which is also an archival image because they no longer exist as well, as my grandmother no longer physically exists in this form. So when I put these two images side by side, there was something in my gut that told me that there was a similarity between them, that there was something there, and I could feel it viscerally in myself. And that's sort of what the title is about, In the Presence of Absence, because as I stood before these two images of things that aren't physically with us, I could feel that. And that's sort of where the interest in the family photos came from. It wasn't really like a drive to work with archival material or a drive to work with family material. It was just that there was this really heavy relationship going on there. I do also play with sort of like older and newer technologies in my work. I use a lot in the installation In the Presence of Absence, there are also these old handmade wooden TV sets that hold tablets. So you're looking at a new form of technology with the digital tablet that's inside sort of like this wooden handmade sculptural kind of structure that emulates an old television set. And so there is kind of like a conversation going on there about the evolution of technology. And part of it was stimulated for me by this idea of sitting, in front of my television set as a small child in Florida and with my family and watching to see if school was going to be canceled because of a hurricane. So it's kind of juxtaposed with all of these large screens and projections and lighting effects. And I like that idea of mixing the old with the new.
This is Art Uncovered. We'll be right back. Thanks again for tuning in, all. As you may have noticed, this podcast may sound a little different than it did about a month ago. And that is because I moved this podcast into my own name so that I can grow it in a way that benefits my guests, the conversations, and the listeners. So a lot is going to stay the same. This will still be a weekly interview-based podcast highlighting the work and practice of emerging artists, but some things have changed with this move. The big difference is how our episodes will be presented. So our podcast now has its own URL, artuncoveredpodcast.com. There I'm able to organize, group, and archive conversations based on theme. So basically I'm going to be creating playlists based on a theme so that you can listen to a stream of conversations all related to a certain idea. Those ideas will range from specified media to a common conceptual idea such as climate change, race and identity, family, etc. So you'll also notice on our website in the upper right-hand corner a donate button. Since I'm running this podcast now on my own without the backing of a company, any donation will be graciously accepted. It will help ensure the continuation of this podcast, and it will also help fund special conversation episodes that will take the form of recorded panel discussions and live events. All that information and more is available on our website and also on our Instagram page at art_uncovered_podcast. Thanks for listening. Thanks for following. And now back to the episode. Hello again. My guest this week was Allison Maria Rodriguez. Before the break, we were talking about her use of archival photographs alongside newer technologies. And we'll return now to talk about how she uses sound in her installations. I'm curious about how sound functions or does sound function, right? 'Cause I guess I'm thinking about In the Presence of Absence, and we were talking about the use of photography, and obviously photography has no sound. And just thinking about the immersiveness of your installations, there are like multiple videos that are being projected and playing at the same time. So I guess I'm wondering how you handle sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'm I'm not a sound artist, and I'm also very hesitant about, or I should say I'm very careful about how I choose sound, because I feel like sound can be so driving. It can be so overpowering about how it forces the person experiencing the work to respond to it. So I don't want to drive in that particular kind of way. So I'm very careful about it. And usually I use very simplistic sounds. In the presence of absence, the only audio is a Kauai bird's call, which is an extinct bird.
Oh,
and it's a mating call. So you hear the bird call out, and then you hear a empty space where the female bird is supposed to respond. That's not there. And then you hear the bird call out again. So it's just this bird call that has sort of a fluty kind of, it's fluty kind of feeling to it.
Like the instrument.
So it sounds sort of spiritual a little bit, as well. And so I like that idea that it melds to entering a sacred space and having that kind of feeling of being in like a temple or a church or something like that, where you don't actually have to know that that's what the bird is. It's also part of nature, which I think about nature as a sacred space. But once you know what the bird is, it works in with all the other. I'm also using archival footage of other extinct species in the installation. So it works together. I also have another installation I'm working on now that's using the wind of the Arctic as the audio track.
So smart.
Different wind recordings that I did while I was there. So I don't create really heavily driven audio usually.
And that works out so well for some of your recent installations, right? Because the first project we spoke about was Subversive Dreams, which was through COVID, so the projection was through a storefront. I assume there was no audio involved in that installation.
Right.
Yeah. And then there's another project, maybe if you could tell us a bit about, it's called The Strength of Very Small Things. And I think that was also through storefronts, right?
Right. That project ran from December 2020 into January 2021.
Okay.
And so it was created entirely with COVID in mind. I was commissioned by the Jewish Arts Collaborative to do a piece in honor of Hanukkah. There were different artists from different backgrounds throughout the city that were commissioned to do these projects. And it was supposed to be sort of broadly about the idea of light in darkness and resilience. And so I chose to focus on some of the Arctic work that I'd been doing. Basically, when I was approached to do the commission, I was already working on this larger body of work about this fellowship that I did in the Arctic at the Churchill Northern Studies Center. And I was very into that work. And what I was working on is for an inside venue where you walk in and are immersed. When I was approached about this project, I just couldn't conceptually steer in another direction. So I decided to take elements of this. I have so much footage. So I decided to kind of work still in the same vein. And I focused it on these Daphnia, which are water fleas. When I was there at the research station, I basically couldn't go anywhere without an armed bear guard. So I couldn't leave the station unless I went with somebody who had an armed bear guard with them.
What is that?
I was sort of begged.
What is it?
An armed bear guard for polar bears. Like, you couldn't leave the research station without someone there with a gun for guarding against stuff. And there's a whole process. It's not like they just shoot the bear, but you have to be with somebody who's trained to manage if there's a polar bear.
Wow.
So you cannot leave the building. You can't go walk around outside. You can't even stand around outside. You have to be with somebody. So I would just beg any scientist that was there to take me. And I just ended up going along with these two women who were studying Daphnia, which are water fleas. And I had a very spiritual experience where I felt very connected to these little tiny things that you can barely see. And I think even though going there, I intellectually have known that we are all interconnected, that everything is interconnected. But I think having this really intimate experience with a water flea and feeling myself and my future connected to this water flea, this Daphnia, was just really profound for me. So the work itself, the Strength of Very Small Things, is about our interconnected future with these Daphnia. They're studied as indicator species of climate change. So the scientists are looking at how these Daphnia respond to changes in the water temperature that will be an indicator of how we will respond to changes in temperature.
Oh my gosh.
So our futures are intertwined. They're really beautiful. They're really beautiful to look at.
How have they been changing, or have they been changing yet due to climate change?
Yes. Basically where I was in Manitoba, Churchill, Manitoba, it's right on the Arctic's edge. And so you can see climate change happening there at such an accelerated rate. The scientists that go back year after year talk about like seeing less animals. Like if they're studying birds, they're like, there's less birds here than last year. It's just incredible. And I learned that there would be, in 20 years, there would be no ice on the Hudson Bay in the summertime. So it's just it's incredible. That was also something that was really impactful for me, was seeing climate change with my own eyes in this way that was really profound. I think we know about it culturally, but we don't necessarily think about it the same way we think about a burning building. The immediacy isn't necessarily there. And to kind of see it in this way and to interact with scientists who are dealing with it, every year and seeing that difference yearly is sort of incredible. So I use this imagery of the Daphnia, and then I basically extracted them from their context and colored them and animated them to make them larger than life. And I used footage of the women in this vast Arctic landscapes collecting the Daphnia. And I also used footage of beluga whales because I interacted with the beluga whales while I was there as well. So there's kind of this parallel between the large and the small, and also the northern lights were very heavily figured into the installation. So it was about that experience, but sort of the different aspects of it, I suppose.
One more question about this project. Can you talk about your decision to project in the circle format as opposed to the traditional rectangle that we're used to seeing in relation to screens anyway?
Yeah. So there's the circle that's suspended. There's two circles in that installation. And the one that's suspended is the one where the Daphnia are. And I think part of that is an aesthetic attraction to that shape, as well as the fact that like looking at them under a microscope is that shape as well. So it emulates kind of like the way that I originally saw them.
So I have one final question for you, Allison, and I guess in a way I'm kind of critiquing the way that I asked you the questions about your work, because I kind of phrased it in this way where I suggested that you were trying to connect two separate things, right? Whether it's your identity with climate change or whether it's childhood fantasies with climate change. But as I was talking there, and I'm kind of thinking with my mouth right now, but it's an interesting connection that I'm making, is that it seems like nothing is disconnected from climate change. So I guess I'm wondering if that's something that you think about, or is that a thought that kind of swims in your brain?
Absolutely, for sure. I mean, I do There's another project called Wish You Were Here, Greetings from the Galapagos, where I think about the planet as a brain experiencing climate change as trauma. So all of my projects, I think, kind of go in this way of connecting not what you'd initially think are related things, but that are related things, because it's all interconnected. Mm-hmm. And I choose these seemingly unrelated things that I see as holding a profound intimacy in them, a way that I personally intimately relate to them, as well as that I think that the viewer can intimately relate to them in a way that perhaps they don't approach thinking about climate change.
Well, Allison, that's all the time we have for today.
Sort of like
thank you so much, not just for this conversation, but for the work that
as you're
you
saying,
do.
Yes, it's not.
It's
not
quite important to all of us at this moment in time. So yeah, thank you again so much, Allison.
Thank you too. I'm honored that you're interested, like I said, in me and my work. Thank you so much, and thank you for the compliment about my work. That really means a lot to me. Thank you.
All right, listeners, that's all for this week. Make sure to tune in next week, as I will be speaking with Gabby Magali, a Mexican-American artist whose work encourages strength and independence in the women of her culture. You don't want to miss it. Bye-bye.